So gentlemen, what do you get when you pour boiling water down a rabbit hole? Boiling water down a rabbit hole.
Dinner.
Hot cross bunnies. Now earlier, yes, earlier someone said, I was trying to make a joke.
My Amadeus laugh.
It gets even worse as we go on. Now I was out running, and I try and run every weekend now. Every Saturday I go out and I try and keep in shape because I've been doing these half marathons. And so on Saturday I'm out, I'm probably about 10 miles in, I'm tired, it's so hot outside, I run with my dog, and I had forgotten to bring my earphones with me, so I couldn't listen to any of the fabulous music that John Seal has a habit of bringing in and sharing with us. So I was stuck having to figure out what to do with my mind. And I looked down, my dog was tired, it was dragging, it hadn't gotten enough water, it was hot outside, it wears this big fur coat as it goes running around. And we try and get it in the water, but that only happens once during the trip. And so then I see off in the distance an area where there's nobody else running, a little bunny on the side path. And I said, I know how to pick up the spirits of my little dog. And he's a lab. Well, actually, she's a lab. Her name is Sparta, and she's about 8 years old. So I took the leash off of Sparta, and she stuck with me for about another 20 yards till she smelled that rabbit, and then whoosh, right off into the brush, chasing that rabbit, trying to catch it. And you know, and I know, she wouldn't even know what to do if she caught the rabbit. But she was having so much fun zipping in and out and around the bushes trying to catch those rabbits. And it's the funniest thing to see the rabbits turn tail and go bolting. And I just went on and on. About 200 yards later, I whistled her name and she came running and she rejoined me. And she was so happy, her ears had perked up, her eyes were all excited, she had this extra energy. But she didn't catch the rabbit. And as she came back, we kept running, and eventually I put the leash back on her when we saw some other people and dogs. But after about 10 minutes, I noticed she was not running the way she had before. She was worse than even before she was tired. And then I started to pay attention, and I looked down and I saw she had all these foxtails in her coat. She probably had about 40 or 50 foxtails, and they were starting to work their way through her fur coat, get into her joints, really start bothering her, and she was no longer very happy. So I had to stop and take 50 of these foxtails out, one by one, until finally she was back to her normal self. Now I was originally planning to come to this meeting and talk about how wonderful it is to be a dog rather than a rabbit, and how the dogs were the epitome, the acme of hunters, and how they had packs and how they could go around and corner these rabbits and tear into them and eat them at will, and how wonderful it was to be on offense all the time. But then I started thinking, that's not really what happened. What really happened is the rabbits have a burrow that they can zip to very quickly. And before they get there, they run this dog rabbit through the briar patch. You guys remember the whole briar patch of the rabbits? And the dog thinks it's having fun. The dog thinks it's getting close to getting that rabbit, but it never gets to it. And then 15 minutes later, she is filled with all these foxtails. And if I wasn't there, what would happen to the dog? It'd be miserable. I don't know what they do in the wild. Do they go and eat those out of each other in order to pick them free? So it really wasn't the triumph of the dog. It was more like a stalemate, and actually the defeat of the dog if given enough time, if it hadn't been called away, and if I hadn't fixed the problem. So I keep running, and eventually I say, what else in my experience is this similar to? And then it dawns upon me that this is very similar to what you guys are holding in your hands. And what you're holding in your hands is this really neat graph that was put together in French originally by one of the logicians who was in charge of Napoleon's army. And this is a graph of 1812. Are you guys familiar with 1812 Overture?
Yes.
Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 ba-bum. We listened to it on the 4th of July all the time. It was actually put together by a Russian composer, Tchaikovsky, and because we celebrate merit and genius wherever it comes, we celebrate it here in America, and we play it during our 4th of July. And this is a celebration of the Russian triumph over the French in the War of 1812. And it really was amazing. So let me go over what this graph shows right now, since I made reference to it. At the very beginning of this conflict, Napoleon assembled 442,000 French in order to march upon Moscow. And because he got delayed in putting these people together, he didn't start until about June. He really should have started in the spring. That was his first mistake. He had about 442,000 men, about 30,000 cavalry, and about 1,000 cannons. And thousands of horses, because the logistics of trying to supply this army was incredible. It was the biggest army that the world has seen since Xerxes tried to invade and take over Athens, and it had a similar outcome. Facing them was the army of the Russians. The Russians had over 1 million men to call upon, but they only had at any one time about 150,000. They like to concentrate in waves. So they had 150,000 versus about 450,000 of the French. The French had a 3-to-1 ratio of people to attack against the Russians. They had about the same amount of cannon, and the French had twice as many. They had 30,000 cavalry versus about 15,000 of Cossacks for the Russians. So you would think, and given Napoleon's genius in battle, that he had the upper hand, that he'd be able to march on Moscow, do what everybody else around that time did. When you captured your opponent's capital, they sued for peace. And so all he had to do is get to Moscow, capture Moscow, and he would beat Russia. Right? Doesn't that make sense? So what was motivating him to do this? Because he already had most of Europe under his belt. He had Spain under his belt. He had Prussia. He had Austria. He had Italy. He had all of this stuff that was already in his empire. But what he didn't have was Britain. Britain was his perennial enemy. Hated him. And they were down in Portugal making a big mess of things down in Portugal and trying to reconquer Spain at the time. And it got even worse when Napoleon left the scene and went off for Russia. But his goal is to try and knock Russia out because he was engaged in economic warfare against Britain. And that wasn't going to work too well, but he thought it would be great. He would deny them as a trading partner, he'd freeze them out, he'd use the same type of tactics we're using against Iran today. But we're making it stick, and he couldn't make it stick. And why? Because Britain had control of all of their colonies. They had ships. They could go trade with people all over the world. So if they didn't get to trade with Europe, yeah, it hurt them a little bit, but not enough to crush it. But Napoleon wanted to take out Russia because Russia was cheating. It was actually doing all of the trading with Europe, or with Britain, and all he did is say, Britain, come to us and throw an American flag up on the ship before you come to shore, and then we'll say we're trading with the Americans. You speak the same language anyways, or close to it. So they were cheating. So that was the motivation for going towards Russia. Now, does anybody know what type of policies Russia used in order to defeat Napoleon?
Winter.
Winter's a big one. Let's talk about that. Before they get to winter, though, they're carrying these big, heavy coats that are supposed to allow them to survive the freezing cold. And before they get there, they have scorching heat. They have this heat that's like 90 degrees. And all these French don't want to be carrying all these heavy coats because they figure, oh, we'll go find some in Moscow when we get there. So a good number of them throw the coats down on the ground. And then what happens? Anybody else have an idea of what happens as they throw their coats down on the ground? They have this thing called a scorched earth policy. Have you guys heard that before? The Russians are smart enough to burn everything in the advancing of the army. So they burn their own towns, they burn their own countrysides, they burn everything there is to eat. And Napoleon can't feed that many people. He has a very long supply line that he's trying to bring all this food down, in addition to 400,000 troops. And because it's so hot, and then it's so cold, all of these tiny little dirt roads now have ruts in them that are breaking all of the wagon wheels. First they're too hot, then they're too cold, and then they become little canyons of ruts. So he can't get the horses through either, because then there's no water. There's no good wells. They've all been poisoned. And you have dysentery and typhus going on. Everything's been destroyed, and because nothing's destroyed, people are eating bad food. And there's rotten food everywhere. And then they start dying from disease, which is similar to what happened to the Athenians when they were attacked by the Spartans, and they hid behind their walls, and eventually they had the beginning of what was like the Black Plague in Athens before it hit Europe later. It was going on the same way to Napoleon's troops. So scorched earth, the Russian winter. There was only 2 major battles along the way, and the Russians concentrated on defensive actions. They'd fight super hard at the beginning, and then in the night they'd melt away. And because all of the horses of Napoleon had been breaking their shoes and dying from dysentery, they also needed certain horseshoes that would work in the mud, and they didn't have them, and work on the cold and the ice, and they didn't have them. So they were much less effective than the cavalry of the Russians. So Napoleon ends up getting all the way to Moscow. Every other place he's ever invaded, all of the citizens come and they want mercy. So they show up with 2 gifts. One is, what do you think? Salt and bread. You guys remember seeing the Spartans when Xerxes came and asked for their surrender and expected to receive the 2 gifts of salt and bread? That's been tradition when you are being invaded and you're being conquered, that, oh well, our army's disappeared, we don't want them to rape all of our women, so we're going to give them salt and bread and the keys to the city, and hopefully they'll have mercy on us. There was no delegation like that in Moscow, and it surprised him, and he didn't know why. 2 days later, 4/5 of Moscow gets burned to the ground. All of the food that he wanted, all of the jackets for all the men who'd thrown the jackets on the ground, all of anything that they could use to resupply their horses, gone. And so now if you look at this graph, he's gone from 420,000 down to only about 100,000 by the time he reaches Moscow. And then it starts turning cold. And then you'll see what the temperatures are as he starts retreating. So the temperature starts off at a warm 32 degrees Fahrenheit, not really that warm, and by the time he gets all the way down, it's like negative 36 degrees. And he ends up with only 10,000 men by the time he gets back, from 420 to 10,000. Napoleon let loose the dogs of war, and the hot-crossed bunnies beat him. Fellow Toastmasters.